A light drizzle fell steadily on the cobblestone streets of Portland, Oregon, like a thin veil draped across the gray sky. It was late October, and the autumn air carried the characteristic chill of the Pacific Northwest. Sophie Turner, 29, stepped out from the back door of Westside Books, the city's most famous used bookstore, dragging a heavy black trash bag behind her. She wore a faded yellow raincoat with worn sleeves, her damp light brown hair clinging to her cheeks. Her old rubber boots hit the ground, making soft squelching sounds on the wet alley pavement that led behind St. John's Church. Her breath puffed out in small white clouds in the cold air. She paused for a moment, looking up at the vibrant red maple leaves trembling under the rain, as if they too were trying to hold on to the last traces of warmth before the long winter. It was a rare, peaceful moment in her busy workday sorting old books, chatting with customers, and sometimes quietly reading a page in a hidden corner of the shop. But then a strange sound broke the stillness, a stifled, broken sob echoing from the deep shadows of the alley. Sophie tilted her head, listening. The crying wasn't loud, but it carried a pain she could feel, like an old wound torn open. She set the trash bag down, wiped her hands on her faded canvas apron, and walked slowly toward the sound. The rain soaked through her coat, making her shiver slightly, but she didn't care. Something about that cry stirred her heart, an instinct she couldn't explain. As she drew closer, the faint glow of a distant street lamp illuminated a figure. A man sat slumped beside a dumpster, his head bowed, shoulders shaking. He wore an expensive black suit, but it was disheveled, soaked, and stained from the ground. His polished leather shoes were caked with mud, and his hand clutched a small, glinting object, a gold wedding ring, lying abandoned on the pavement like a discarded promise. He didn't look up, only continued to cry, his suppressed sobs, as if he were trying to hide his pain from the world, but failing. Sophie stood still for a moment, her breath blending with the patter of the rain. She didn't know who he was, or what had reduced a man in such an elegant suit to this broken state. But she understood that feeling, the sense of loss, of emptiness, like when she stood by the graves of her parents and little brother after the car accident 7 years ago, or when she discovered her fiancé, the man she'd trusted completely, embracing her best friend in the apartment they had chosen together. 3 years since canceling her engagement, she'd learned to keep going, not by forgetting, but by opening her heart to those who needed her. And right now, this man clearly needed someone. Without another thought, Sophie stepped forward and knelt beside him. Her knees touched the cold ground, rainwater seeping through her thin jeans, but she didn't notice. She placed a hand on his shoulder, gently, the way she'd once comforted children lost in the bookstore looking for their mothers. He flinched, looking up briefly, his eyes red and blurred with tears and rain, then dropped his head again, as if ashamed to be seen at his weakest. But Sophie didn't leave. She pulled him into a hug, not too tight, just enough for him to feel her presence. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the damp earth and rain, creating a strange fragrance she'd never forget. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered, her voice soft but firm like a promise. "I'm just here." He didn't reply, but she felt his body gradually relax in her arms. His crying quieted, blending into the steady sound of the rain. They sat like that for a long time, two strangers, nameless, without past, connected only by shared pain in the dark alley. Sophie didn't ask anything, didn't need to know who he was or what had happened. To her, sometimes a hug was enough to say what words couldn't reach. Finally, when his sobs stopped completely, Sophie let go. He still didn't look up, just silently wiped his face with a wet sleeve. She stood, intending to leave, but then her eyes caught the wedding ring lying on the ground. It was tiny, glinting under the streetlight like a shard of a shattered dream. She bent down to pick it up, her cold fingers brushing the cool gold. She didn't know why she did it, maybe instinct, maybe curiosity. But she quietly slipped the ring into his suit pocket, then turned away without another word. As she walked back to the rear door of Westside, the rain continued its steady rhythm like a wordless, sad song. She glanced back one last time. The man still sat there, motionless, but the ring was now in his pocket, a mystery she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. She closed the door and returned to the bookstore, where old shelves and the smell of damp paper awaited her. But in her heart, a strange feeling lingered, as if that hug hadn't just been for him, but for her too, a part of herself she'd buried long ago. Stepping inside, Sophie pulled off her raincoat and hung it on the wooden hook by the door, revealing a simple gray sweater underneath. She brushed back her wet hair, water droplets trailing down her hands, and let out a soft sigh. This wasn't the first time she'd done something like this, helped a stranger with no expectation in return. For her, it was the only way to keep her heart beating after everything she'd lost. Sophie, 29, was a gentle and kind woman, but she carried scars that could never fade. 7 years ago, her life shattered when her entire family, her father, mother, and little brother, died in a car accident on Highway 26. A drunk driver had crashed into their car on the way back from a camping trip in Cedar Forest, a trip she would have joined if not for a weekend shift at Westside. She survived, but the cost was sleepless nights wondering why she hadn't been with them. Then, 3 years ago, before that old wound could heal, a new one tore open. Daniel, her college fiancé, the man she dreamed of building a new family with, betrayed her. She found him embracing Lisa, her best friend since high school, in the apartment they'd picked out together just 2 months before their wedding. Sophie called off the engagement immediately, returned the ring she'd once cherished, and cut all ties. Since then, she'd chosen a quiet life at Westside Books, where old books and other people's stories became her refuge. She didn't seek love or attention, but she was always ready to lend a hand to those in need, whether patiently helping a customer find a rare book or quietly packing stacks of used books to send to poor children in rural Oregon. For Sophie, kindness wasn't something she tried to show. It was the fragile thread tying her to the world, and perhaps the only way she knew to heal herself. The next morning, Portland awoke to a rare, restless energy. The rain had stopped, leaving shimmering puddles on the sidewalks and a faint scent of damp earth in the air. Sophie stood behind the counter at Westside Books, flipping through the pages of an old book about Northwest trees, when Maya, her short-haired, green-eyed co-worker, strode in and slapped the latest issue of City Week onto the counter with a loud thwack, her voice brimming with excitement. "Have you seen this?" Sophie looked up, her light brown eyes scanning the bold headline, "Tech billionaire James Bennett left at altar. Fiancé vanishes before vows." Below it was a blurry photo of a man in a suit standing before an elegant but empty wedding reception table. The article detailed how James Bennett, 32, CEO of a prominent social tech company, had been abandoned by his fiancée just before their wedding at a luxurious downtown Portland hotel. No explanation, no trace. The bride simply disappeared 2 hours before the vows. Maya giggled, shaking her head. "Drama like this. The whole city will be buzzing for a week. They say he's cold as ice, but getting ditched like this probably melted him down to water." Sophie gave a faint smile, but didn't reply. She didn't care for gossip, yet the name James Bennett stirred an odd feeling in her, like an unclear puzzle piece. So, she closed the book and turned back to sorting a stack of children's books slated for the Riverside Community Library by the weekend. The news spread through Portland like wildfire. By noon, Bridgetown Coffee, a few blocks from Westside, was abuzz with whispers from hipster groups clutching artful lattes, eagerly discussing the jilted billionaire. Some joked that he'd probably programmed an AI bride that glitched and deleted itself. While on social media, the hashtag number sign, Bennett left. At altar climbed the ranks with paparazzi shots of him leaving the hotel, face impassive, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. But no one knew that the night before, he'd been slumped in the alley behind St. John's Church, broken in the arms of a stranger. And Sophie, the one who'd held him, had no idea the name in the headlines belonged to that same man. 3 days later, the bell above Westside's door jingled as a man stepped inside. Sophie was perched on an old wooden ladder, holding a stack of hardcovers, when she heard steady footsteps approaching. She turned, and her heart skipped a beat. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood there, wearing a dark gray wool coat instead of the soaked black suit she'd seen before. His dark hair was neatly combed, but his deep blue eyes, no longer red-rimmed, still carried the weariness of sleepless nights. In his hand was a crumpled scrap of paper with a few handwritten lines. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and slightly hoarse. "Do you have The Alchemist?" Sophie set the books down and stepped off the ladder, recognizing him instantly. Not from the newspaper photo, but from the way his shoulders slumped slightly, as if still bearing an invisible weight. This was the man from the alley, the one she'd hugged in the rain without asking his name. She recalled that fleeting moment when they'd been there together. She'd whispered something about The Alchemist, how it was the book she'd read when she felt lost after her family's death. She hadn't expected him to remember, let alone show up here. "Do you always hug strangers in alleys, or am I just lucky?" he continued, his tone laced with faint sarcasm, but his eyes held a curiosity, as if trying to figure her out. A slight smile flickered across his lips, the first since that night, but it vanished quickly. Sophie froze, her cheeks warming slightly. She wasn't good at banter, especially not with this sharp, unexpected kind. "Only when they look like they need it," she replied softly, then turned away to hide her flustered expression, heading toward the classic literature shelves. She tried to stay composed, though her mind spun. "He's James Bennett. The man from the alley is James Bennett." Before she could grab the book, a voice cut through from the counter. "Hey, isn't that the guy who got dumped?" A customer, a guy with round glasses, whispered to his friend, pointing at James. The murmurs began to spread, curious eyes turning toward him. James's grip tightened on the scrap of paper, his face hardening, a flash of irritation in his eyes. Sophie acted quickly, stepping forward and lightly tugging his sleeve, guiding him into a secluded corner behind the sci-fi shelves where thick books blocked the crowd's view. "Don't mind them," she said quietly, her tone reassuring. "Portland loves drama, but they'll forget soon enough." He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time, not as a passerby, but as someone trying to understand something. "You seem used to saving people," he said, his voice lower, the sarcasm gone, replaced by a hint of sincerity. "Let's say I am," she replied, then turned back to the shelf, pulling out a worn paperback copy of The Alchemist and handing it to him. Her hand trembled slightly, but she hid it. "This is my favorite edition. It's not new, but it has soul." James took the book, his fingers brushing the cover as if weighing something. "Thanks," he said simply, but his gaze lingered on her longer than usual. He didn't mention the hug, and neither did she, but they both knew this wasn't their first meeting, and it might not be their last. When he left, the door's bell jingled again. Sophie stood by the shelves, still holding another book she'd meant to sort, watching through Westside's large glass window as he stepped onto the street, his tall figure blended into the crowd. James Bennett, she thought, the name now real in her mind, but to her, he wasn't the billionaire or the jilted groom from the headlines. He was just the man from the alley, the one who'd left behind a ring and a question she hadn't yet answered. James Bennett, 32, was a man who lived in a world of logic and power. As CEO of a Portland-based social tech company, he was known for his cold demeanor and privacy. He'd built his empire from nothing, with sharp intellect and an uncanny ability to predict trends. Few knew he'd grown up in a broken family, where affection was a luxury he never had. His fiancée, Olivia, had left him before the wedding because she couldn't handle the media pressure and his distance, a blow that left him feeling out of control for the first time. Sophie's hug in the alley was something he hadn't expected, and The Alchemist was why he'd returned, not just for the book, but for a flicker of light in the darkness he wasn't ready to admit. In the days following their first encounter at Westside Books, James Bennett began showing up more often, an unspoken habit neither he nor Sophie addressed. At first, he came with simple excuses, buying books, usually ones Sophie had mentioned during their brief embrace in the rain, like The Alchemist or other classics about the search for life's meaning. But gradually he lingered longer, not just to browse but to talk, though their conversations often started awkwardly and ended in silence. Sophie didn't mind. She enjoyed the quiet peace of those moments, him standing by the shelves, flipping through pages with a cool focus, while she sorted old books or jotted notes in her small notebook. Westside, with its towering shelves and the faint scent of damp paper in the air, became their meeting place. Unplanned, unexpected, just the presence of two people who had once touched each other's pain on a rainy night. Sophie kept a careful distance, never asking too much, never pressing him to say more than brief replies about books or Portland's weather. She recommended healing books she loved. The Alchemist remained her first pick, followed by Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning or The Night Circus with its gentle magic. But she never probed why he kept coming, though she could guess parts of it. Once, he held the copy of The Alchemist he'd bought the week before, flipped to the first page, and asked, "Do you really believe the universe helps us find what we want?" Sophie smiled, replying, "I believe sometimes we have to help ourselves first." and then the universe follows. He didn't say more, just nodded slightly, but his gaze lingered on her longer than usual, as if weighing something deeper. Not everyone was as at ease with James's presence as Sophie. Maya, 25, her best friend and co-worker at Westside, eyed him suspiciously every time he walked through the door. Petite, with short green-dyed hair, always in indie band t-shirts and a nose ring, Maya was the type to speak her mind, sometimes to the point of discomfort. One afternoon, after James left following a brief chat with Sophie about sci-fi books, Maya pulled her to the corner of the counter, voice low but wary. "He's a billionaire, Sophie. James Bennett, the guy all of Portland's talking about for getting left at the altar. You think he's for real, or just taking advantage of your kindness?" Sophie frowned, setting her pen down. "What do you mean?" Maya crossed her arms, eyes sharp. "I mean, you're too nice, and who knows? Billionaires don't just wander into used bookstores looking for soulmates. I got conned once by a guy claiming he was an artist who got me. Turned out he just wanted rent money. I don't want you hurt again." Sophie sighed. She knew Maya meant well. Maya had shared her own story of a brief fling with a deadbeat musician who ditched her after borrowing cash he never repaid, but she shook her head. "He's not that kind of person." "I don't know." Emily huffed. "Just be careful," then returned to work, leaving Sophie with a fleeting doubt that quickly faded. The connection between Sophie and James grew slow and hesitant, like two strangers trying to navigate an invisible wall. One stormy evening, as Portland was enveloped by wet gusts blowing off the Willamette River, James arrived at Westside later than usual, his dark gray wool coat soaked, black hair dripping onto the floor. The store was nearing closing time, with only a few straggling customers. Maya had left early, unable to stand the cold. Sophie was tidying the counter when he walked in, carrying the scent of rain and a hint of loneliness. "I thought you wouldn't come in this weather," she said, half joking, half serious. He shrugged. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, and for the first time, she sensed a crack in his icy shell. They stayed late, the neon lights outside flickering through the big glass window, reflecting raindrops streaking down. Perhaps to break the silence, James approached the ancient coffee machine in the corner, a relic from the 80s the Westside staff kept, despite its frequent breakdowns. "Want some coffee?" he asked, holding the stained glass pot. Sophie nodded, curious to see him wrestle with a machine even she didn't fully understand. He fumbled, pouring beans in awkwardly, pressing the wrong button, then spilling hot water across the counter as he tried to fix it, a black stain spreading over the wood. "Damn it," he muttered. The first time she'd seen him lose his cool, and she couldn't help it. She burst out laughing, a clear sound cutting through the stillness. James looked up, surprised. Then a rare smile tugged at his lips. "I'm not that bad, am I?" Sophie shook her head, still laughing. "No, you just look like a kid doing chores for the first time." In that moment, under Westside's warm, golden light, he looked at her as if seeing sunlight after a long winter, and she, though she wouldn't admit it, felt her heart lighten. That night, once the coffee machine finally cooperated and they sat across from each other with steaming mugs, James opened up unexpectedly. "She left because she couldn't handle the pressure," he said, eyes on his cup, voice flat like he was recounting someone else's story. "The media, living with someone like me, cold, distant. She said, I don't blame her, but I don't know how to be different." Sophie listened, her hands tightening around her mug, then replied, soft but steady, "I used to think I wasn't good enough. My ex-fiancé cheated with my best friend right before our wedding. I wondered what I did wrong, but then I realized it wasn't my fault. I got through it by helping others because then I stopped thinking about my own pain." James looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, they weren't just strangers. They were two broken people trying to piece themselves back together. When he left, the rain still fell steadily outside. Sophie stood behind the counter, watching his figure fade through the glass. She didn't know what was starting between them, but she felt a shift. Nothing grand or clear, just a small spark, like Westside's light on old book pages, enough to make her look forward to the next time. As time passed, the awkward encounters between Sophie and James at Westside Books became an essential part of their lives, though neither acknowledged it aloud. One afternoon in early November, with Portland still clinging to the crisp chill of autumn, James walked into the bookstore with an unusual determination. holding a small ticket stamped with the Portland Book Festival logo, the city's biggest book event, where authors, publishers, and thousands of book lovers gathered each year. He set the ticket on the counter where Sophie was labeling a stack of old books and said in a low, steady voice, "Come with me next week." Sophie looked up, her light brown eyes flashing with surprise, then shook her head with a faint smile. "I'm not good with crowds, you know that. Thousands of people crammed into a convention center. It sounds suffocating just thinking about it." James tilted his head, undeterred. "I don't like crowds either, but I thought you'd enjoy the used book stalls there. They even have a section for kids' books like the ones you send out." She studied him, noticing a spark in his eyes. Not the usual cool detachment, but a rare sincerity, but she still declined. "I'll think about it, but don't get your hopes up." He didn't give up as easily as she'd expected. Over the next week, James stopped by West Side almost daily, each time with a new reason to sway her. One day mentioning an author she loved who'd be signing books, another talking about a rare book stall with imports from Europe, and once just standing by the shelves and asking, "Aren't you even a little curious?" Sophie began to find his persistence amusing, but it also softened her resolve. Finally, on a Saturday morning, when he showed up with a different flyer, not for the book festival, but for a book donation event for rural Oregon kids at a small suburban library, she sighed, setting her pen down on the counter. "Fine, but just this. No festival, no crowds." James grinned, a rare smile lighting up his face. "I knew you'd say yes." That day, Portland's sky unexpectedly cleared, the relentless weeks of rain giving way to rare sunshine, filtering through the vibrant red maple leaves along the road to the suburbs. Sophie sat beside James in his sleek black SUV, feeling a touch out of place, leaving the familiarity of West Side for something new. They arrived at a small town about 40 minutes from the city, where volunteers were setting up a book donation booth outside the community library. The atmosphere was lively, but not overwhelming, with wooden tables piled with children's books, a few kids darting around unopened boxes, and the scent of coffee wafting from a tiny indie cafe across the street. Sophie instantly felt more at ease. She stepped out of the car, cradling a box of old books from West Side she'd picked out beforehand. Titles like The Very Hungry Caterpillar and Charlotte's Web, stories she believed would bring joy to the kids. James, though unaccustomed to events like this, didn't stand on the sidelines. He quietly helped her arrange books on the table, his hands, usually at home on a keyboard, fumbling as he stacked them, occasionally dropping a few for her to pick up. "You don't have to do this," she said, but he shrugged. "I didn't come here to watch." They worked in silence for a while, until a group of kids, 5 or 6 of them dressed in colorful fall jackets, ran over, peering curiously at the books. A curly-haired girl, about 6, pointed at Where the Wild Things Are and asked, "Can you read it to us, mister?" James froze, glancing at Sophie for help, but she grinned mischievously and pressed the book into his hands. "Go on, it's not hard." He took the book, sat on a small wooden chair among the kids, and started reading in his deep voice, though he clearly had no idea how to play the storyteller. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind. He paused, attempting a monster growl that sounded more like a cough, sending the kids into giggles. Sophie stood by the nearby coffee table, holding a paper cup of hot latte, unable to hold back her laughter, a bright, clear sound ringing through the peaceful space. James looked up, feigning a frown. "What's so funny?" But even he couldn't stay serious, the corner of his mouth lifting as he saw her delight. The kids clapped and shouted, "Keep going, Monster Man!" And he obliged, adding a bit more expression this time, though still clumsy enough to knock over a water cup nearby. Sophie watched him, sunlight streaming through the cafe window, and for the first time, she thought he wasn't the cold man from the alley anymore. He was someone learning to open up, little by little. The donation event wrapped up by late afternoon, the sun dipping behind distant hills, painting Oregon's sky a brilliant orange. On the drive back, James was quiet for a while, then said suddenly, "I've never done anything like today. I mean, for other people, with no gain." Sophie turned to him, slightly surprised. "So why did you?" He kept his eyes on the road, his voice low but firm. "Because of you. You make it look easy, like helping others is the most natural thing in the world." She didn't reply right away, just smiled, a warmth spreading through her like the rare sunshine of that day. A few weeks later, James surprised her again. One morning, he arrived at Westside not with a book or a question, but with a bigger idea. Inspired by the donation event, he'd funded a mobile library, a small truck filled with books to travel to remote Oregon areas where kids rarely got new reading material. "It'll start running next month," he said, hands in his coat pockets, trying to downplay his pride. Sophie stood behind the counter, eyes lighting up. "Really? You're not kidding?" He nodded, then pulled a small wooden box from his pocket and slid it toward her. "And this is for you." She opened it, revealing an antique book press, polished walnut with intricate carvings, something she'd once dreamed of using to restore her beloved old books at the shop. Her hands trembled as she touched it, eyes welling up. "James, I don't know what to say." He shrugged, his voice softer than usual. "You don't have to say anything. I just thought it belonged with you." When he left, Sophie stood quietly by the counter, still holding the book press, gazing out Westside's large glass window. The rare Portland sunlight streamed in, illuminating the weathered shelves, and she felt a new beginning, not just for him, but for her too. James was no longer the broken man from the alley, and she was no longer just someone who healed others. Together, they were creating something warm, even if it was only the start. Winter arrived in Portland earlier than usual, bringing biting winds that swept through the cobblestone streets and rattled the large glass windows of Westside Books. Sophie stood behind the counter, sorting a stack of newly arrived books, her heart lighter than ever after the warm days spent with James. Their relationship had no label, no promises, but she felt a growing connection. Not love, at least not yet, but something genuine, like two imperfect puzzle pieces fitting together. James still visited Westside regularly, sometimes bringing coffee from Bridgetown, sometimes just standing quietly by the shelves and asking about the old books she loved. She began to think that perhaps, after all her losses, she was finding a place to belong. But then, on a late November afternoon, with the sky gray and a steady drizzle pattering on Westside's roof, the shop's door jingled and a woman stepped inside. Not an ordinary customer, but a presence that suddenly weighed down the air. She was tall, with glossy blonde hair tied high, wearing an expensive cream fur coat, her high heels clicking rhythmically on the wooden floor. Sophie looked up, mildly surprised but unconcerned, until the woman marched straight to the secluded corner where James stood, holding a copy of Dune. The woman's voice cut through the peaceful bookstore atmosphere like a knife. "So this is where you've been hiding, James." James looked up, his face instantly hardening into a mask Sophie hadn't seen since their early encounters. The book in his hand closed with a soft thump as he straightened, his voice cool and controlled. "Olivia, what are you doing here?" Sophie froze behind the counter, immediately understanding. This was her, the woman who'd left him at the altar, the one whose absence had brought him to that rain-soaked alley months ago. Olivia's perfectly manicured hand reached out, touching James's arm with familiar ease. "We need to talk," she said, her voice honey-sweet but with a sharp edge. "I made a mistake. The media, the pressure, it was all too much. But I've had time to think, and I want us to try again." Sophie felt her chest tighten, a strange ache spreading through her. She busied herself with reorganizing books that didn't need reorganizing, trying not to eavesdrop, but unable to block out their conversation. James's voice remained low, controlled. "There's nothing to discuss, Olivia. You made your choice." Olivia laughed, a practiced melodic sound. "Don't be so dramatic. We both know we're perfect for each other. The right backgrounds, the right connections." Her gaze drifted around the bookstore, dismissive. "This little escape of yours was cute, but it's time to come back to reality." Sophie couldn't help looking up, catching James's eye briefly across the store. Something flickered in his expression, confusion, perhaps, or conflict. The moment hung between them, fragile as a page torn from an old book. Then Olivia spotted Sophie watching and smiled, a predatory curve of perfectly glossed lips. "Oh, is she the reason you've been hiding in this dusty place? How quaint." James stiffened. "That's enough, Olivia." But Olivia was already walking toward the counter, her designer heels clicking like a countdown. She stopped directly in front of Sophie, appraising her with cool blue eyes. "So, you're the bookstore girl," she said, her tone making it sound like an accusation. "I should thank you for keeping him distracted while I sorted things out. but he'll be coming home now. Sophie felt heat rise to her cheeks, but years of customer service had taught her to maintain composure. I think that's between you and James, she replied quietly, continuing to sort books with hands that only slightly trembled. Olivia leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Let me give you some advice. Men like James don't end up with girls who sell used books. They might slum it for a while when they're hurt, but they always return to their own kind. Don't delude yourself. Before Sophie could respond, James appeared beside them, his face tense. That's enough. Olivia, we can talk outside. Olivia smiled triumphantly, linking her arm through his. Of course, darling. Let's go somewhere more suitable. As they walked toward the door, James glanced back at Sophie, an unreadable expression in his eyes. Then they were gone, the bell jingling as the door closed behind them. Sophie stood motionless, the book in her hands suddenly heavy. Maya emerged from the back room, having witnessed the entire scene. Who was that? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. His ex-fiancé, Sophie replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The one who left him at the altar. Maya whistled low. And now she wants him back. Classic. She studied Sophie's face. You okay? Of course, Sophie said quickly. It's not like we're just friends. It's his decision. But as she returned to sorting books, a cold feeling settled in her chest. Olivia's words echoed in her mind. Men like James don't end up with girls who sell used books. Perhaps she'd been naive to think their connection meant something more. For the rest of the day, Sophie worked mechanically, helping customers, organizing shelves, but her thoughts remained with James and Olivia. She wondered where they'd gone, what they were discussing, if he was considering taking Olivia back. The possibility hurt more than she wanted to admit. When closing time came, Sophie locked the door and turned off the main lights, leaving only the small lamp at the counter on. She sat on her favorite stool, surrounded by the comforting presence of books, and opened a worn copy of Jane Eyre, a story of love that overcame social barriers. But tonight, the familiar words offered little comfort. The sudden knock at the door startled her. Through the glass, she could see James standing in the rain, no umbrella, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. For a moment, she considered pretending not to hear, to avoid whatever he'd come to say. But then she set the book down and walked to the door. She unlocked it, letting him in. Water dripped from his coat onto the wooden floor, creating small puddles at his feet. Neither spoke immediately, the silence filled with unasked questions. I'm sorry about earlier, he finally said, his voice rough. Olivia shouldn't have spoken to you that way. Sophie nodded, keeping her distance. It's fine. Did you sort things out with her? James ran a hand through his wet hair, droplets scattering. She wants to try again, says she made a mistake. And what do you want? Sophie asked, her voice softer than intended. He looked at her then, really looked at her, his blue eyes intense. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what I wanted. Success, status, a partnership that made sense on paper. Then Olivia left, and everything fell apart. He took a step closer. But that night in the alley, when you found me, something changed. Sophie's heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. James, let me finish, he said gently. These past months, coming here, talking with you, watching you care about these old books and the people who read them, it made me realize how empty my life was before. Olivia left because I was cold, distant. I didn't know how to be different. His voice dropped. But with you, I'm learning. Sophie felt tears threatening, but blinked them back. She's beautiful, successful. You have history. And none of that matters, James replied, taking another step toward her. I told her I'm not going back. Whatever is starting between us. He gestured between himself and Sophie. It's real. It's worth exploring. A tear escaped, rolling down Sophie's cheek. James reached out, gently brushing it away with his thumb. The touch was warm against her cold skin. I can't promise I won't mess up, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm still learning how to open up. But I'd like to try, if you'll let me. Sophie looked up at him, seeing not the wealthy CEO or the man abandoned at the altar, but simply James, the person who'd sat in an alley in the rain, who'd fumbled with an old coffee machine, who'd read Where the Wild Things Are to children with endearing awkwardness. I'd like that too, she replied softly. Outside, the Portland rain continued its steady rhythm, washing the streets clean. Inside West Side Books, surrounded by stories of countless lives and loves, Sophie and James stood together in the gentle lamplight, ready to write a new chapter of their own. The weeks following Olivia's appearance at West Side Books brought changes Sophie hadn't anticipated. James became more present in her life, not just during stolen moments between bookshelves, but in deliberate, meaningful ways. He would arrive at closing time with takeout from local restaurants, sharing dinner with her at the small table in West Side's back room. Sometimes they'd talk for hours about books, childhood memories, or their dreams. Other times they'd sit in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. One snowy December evening, as they walked along the Willamette River, snowflakes catching in Sophie's light brown hair, James reached for her hand. His touch was warm against the winter chill, and she found herself intertwining her fingers with his, a silent acknowledgement of their growing closeness. "I never thanked you properly," he said suddenly, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "For what?" Sophie asked, watching the river flow beneath them, dark and mysterious against the white-dusted banks. "For that night in the alley, for not asking questions, for just being there." His voice was quiet but clear against the hush of falling snow. Sophie squeezed his hand gently. "Sometimes that's all anyone needs." They continued walking, the Portland skyline glittering with holiday lights across the water. James stopped, turning to face her, snowflakes melting on his eyelashes. "I want you to know something," he said, his blue eyes serious. "What's happening between us? It's not because I was hurt, or because you were kind when I needed it. It's because of who you are, your passion for stories, your quiet strength, the way you care about people without expecting anything in return." Sophie felt warmth bloom in her chest despite the cold. For years she'd kept people at a distance, afraid of more loss, more pain. But standing there with James, she found herself wanting to take the risk. "I'm not good at this," she admitted softly. "Being vulnerable, trusting again." "Neither am I," he replied with a small smile. "Maybe we can figure it out together." When he kissed her, gentle and questioning, snowflakes falling around them like pages from an unwritten story, Sophie felt something long dormant within her awakening, hope. But their newfound happiness didn't come without challenges. The Portland business community buzzed with gossip about James Bennett's bookstore romance, as some tabloids called it. Olivia, smarting from rejection, had spread rumors suggesting Sophie was a calculated gold digger who'd targeted James at his most vulnerable. These whispers reached Sophie through unlikely channels. One afternoon, a sleek corporate lawyer in an expensive suit visited West Side, browsing books with obvious disinterest before approaching the counter. "You're Sophie Turner?" he asked, his tone professionally neutral, but his eyes assessing. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm Robert Caldwell, Bennett Tech's legal counsel." He placed his business card on the counter. "James is an important client and friend. I thought we should meet." Sophie maintained her composure, though her heart raced. "I see. Well, we have an excellent selection of legal thrillers if you're interested." Robert's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Clever. Look, I'll be direct. James has been through a difficult time. His judgment might be compromised. Whatever you think you'll get from this relationship, money, connections, social standing, I'd advise reconsidering." Sophie felt a flash of anger, but kept her voice steady. "Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your concern for James, but with all due respect, our relationship is none of your business." "Everything involving James Bennett becomes my business," he replied coolly. "The company's reputation, shareholder confidence, these things matter. A CEO dating a bookstore clerk creates questions. Then perhaps those asking the questions should examine their priorities," Sophie said, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "Now, unless you're buying a book, I have customers to help." Robert studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly as if reassessing. "He said you were different. Perhaps he was right." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope he is." "Right, that is." When she told James about the encounter that evening, his expression darkened with anger. "I'll speak to Robert. He had no right—" "It's okay," Sophie interrupted, placing her hand over his. "I understand why people are concerned. I'm not exactly who they expected for you. James shook his head. That's their problem, not ours. But Sophie couldn't help wondering if there was truth in Robert's implications. Their worlds were vastly different. James moved in circles of wealth and influence, while she found contentment in her modest life among books. Could these differences eventually pull them apart? Her doubts were tested further when James invited her to his company's holiday gala, a lavish affair at Portland's most exclusive hotel. Sophie stood in her small apartment, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She wore a simple emerald green dress she'd found at a vintage shop, elegant, but nothing like the designer gowns she knew would fill the ballroom. You look beautiful, Maya assured her, adjusting a pin in Sophie's upswept hair. Like a classic heroine about to walk into the ball and charm everyone. Sophie smiled weakly. Or like Cinderella before midnight, when everything turns back to pumpkins. Maya rolled her eyes. Stop it. James doesn't care about any of that superficial stuff. That's why he's with you. When James arrived to pick her up, his appreciative gaze as she opened the door told her Maya was right. In his tailored tuxedo, he looked every inch the successful CEO, but the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her had nothing to do with status or appearance. You're stunning, he said simply, offering her a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a tiny book-shaped pendant that opened to reveal miniature pages. It's beautiful, Sophie whispered as he fastened it around her neck. I had it made specially, James explained. The pages contain the first words I ever heard you say. You don't have to say anything. I'm just here. The gala was as intimidating as Sophie had feared. Crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, and Portland's elite dressed in their finest. She felt eyes following them as James led her through the crowd, his hand steady at the small of her back. Whispers followed. That's her, the bookstore girl. How long do you think it will last? Clearly a phase after Olivia. But James remained attentive, introducing her proudly to business associates and friends. Most were politely curious, though some, particularly those close to Olivia, were coldly dismissive. During dinner, Sophie found herself seated beside an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as George Harmon, one of James's first investors. So, you're the young lady who's captured our James's attention, he said, his eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. He tells me you have a gift for finding the right book for the right person. Sophie relaxed slightly. I try. Books have a way of finding the readers who need them most. George nodded thoughtfully. My late wife believed the same. She ran a small library in rural Oregon for 40 years. Said she wasn't just lending books, but possibilities. She sounds wonderful, Sophie replied sincerely. She was. George smiled, then leaned closer. You know, I've known James since he was a determined young man, with nothing but ideas and ambition. I've seen him succeed beyond anyone's expectations, but I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Before Sophie could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Olivia had arrived, stunning in a form-fitting red gown, fashionably late and clearly intent on making an entrance. Her gaze locked on James across the room, a calculated smile spreading across her face. Sophie felt her stomach tighten as Olivia made her way toward them, stopping to greet various guests with air kisses and practice charm. When she reached their table, she placed a manicured hand on James's shoulder. James, darling, you look wonderful, she purred, then turned to Sophie with a brittle smile. And Sophie, what a sweet dress. Vintage, I assume? Before Sophie could respond, James stood, his expression cool. Olivia, I wasn't aware you were on the guest list. Olivia laughed lightly. The foundation always invites me, James. After all, I've been attending these events for years. She glanced around the table. I should say hello to the Prestons. Sophie, do enjoy yourself. These events can be quite overwhelming for newcomers. As she sashayed away, Sophie felt a flicker of insecurity. Olivia belonged in this world of wealth and sophistication in a way Sophie never would. She excused herself, needing a moment alone, and found her way to a quiet balcony overlooking the city. Portland spread before her, holiday lights twinkling against the night sky. She took a deep breath of the cold air, steadying herself. Not exactly your scene, is it? Came a voice from behind her. Sophie turned to find Robert Caldwell, James's lawyer, watching her with curious eyes. Not exactly, she admitted, but the view is beautiful. Robert joined her at the railing. James is making quite a statement tonight, bringing you here. Is that what I am? A statement? Sophie asked, more sharply than intended. Robert considered her for a moment. Perhaps I misjudged you at the bookstore. You're more substantial than I expected. Thank you, I think, Sophie replied dryly. It's a compliment, he assured her. James needs someone real in his life, not another social climber like Olivia. He glanced back toward the ballroom. Just be prepared. People like Olivia don't give up easily when they're used to getting what they want. As if summoned by his words, James appeared at the balcony entrance. His eyes moved between Sophie and Robert, questioning. Everything okay out here? He asked. Robert nodded. Just getting to know Sophie better. She's quite impressive. He straightened his tie. I should get back inside. Clients to schmooze. As he passed James, he added quietly, She's good for you. When they were alone, James joined Sophie at the railing. I'm sorry about Olivia, he said, and for subjecting you to all of this. He gestured toward the glittering ballroom. Sophie turned to face him. Why did you bring me tonight, James? Really? He looked surprised by the question. Because I wanted you with me. Even though I clearly don't fit in with your world, she pressed. James took her hands in his. Sophie, look at me. In there. That's not my world. It's just where I work. My world is wherever I feel most alive, most myself. His eyes held hers intently. And lately, that's with you, between dusty bookshelves or walking in the rain or just sitting quietly together. Sophie felt tears threatening. I keep waiting for you to realize I'm not enough. Not sophisticated enough, not ambitious enough, not... Stop, he said gently. You're more than enough. You're everything I didn't know I was missing. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. When Olivia left me at the altar, I thought my life was shattered. Now I realize it was the best thing that could have happened, because it led me to that alley, to you. In that moment, with Portland glittering below them and the sounds of the gala fading into the background, Sophie made a decision. She was tired of letting fear dictate her choices, tired of waiting for the next loss. Whatever challenges lay ahead, different worlds, disapproving friends, persistent exes, they would face them together. She reached up, cupping James's face in her hands, and kissed him. Not the tentative kiss of new beginnings, but a promise of something deeper, more lasting. Let's go home, she whispered against his lips. James smiled, understanding in his eyes. Home, he agreed, taking her hand. They slipped away from the gala, unnoticed, leaving behind the glitter and pretense for the quiet authenticity they'd found in each other. As they drove through Portland's rain-slicked streets, Sophie looked over at James, his profile illuminated by passing streetlights, and felt a certainty she hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't a fairy tale or a romance novel. It was messier, more complicated, and infinitely more real. But perhaps that was what made it worth fighting for. A place to belong? January brought relentless rain to Portland, turning the city into a landscape of glistening streets and foggy mornings. Inside Westside Books, Sophie had created a winter reading nook, a corner with comfortable chairs, soft blankets, and a carefully curated selection of books perfect for cold days. The bookstore had become busier since an article appeared in Portland Monthly featuring hidden literary gems in the city. The piece included a photo of Sophie arranging books on the vintage shelves and a brief mention of the store's charming manager with an uncanny ability to match readers with their perfect book. What the article didn't mention was Sophie's relationship with James Bennett, though rumors continued to circulate. Some customers now came in hoping to glimpse the billionaire's bookstore girlfriend, but most were genuine book lovers drawn by the store's warm atmosphere and thoughtful collections. On a particularly stormy Tuesday morning, Sophie was surprised to find an elderly woman waiting at the door before opening time, huddled under a large umbrella. She had silver hair pulled into a neat bun and wore a well-tailored wool coat that spoke of quiet elegance. I'm so sorry. We don't open for another 15 minutes, Sophie explained, unlocking the door to let the woman escape the downpour. That's quite all right, dear. I'm happy to wait, the woman replied with a crisp accent that suggested New England roots. I've come a long way to see this place. Sophie invited her in, offering to make tea while the woman browsed. As she prepared the tea in the back room, Maya arrived, shaking rain from her green hair. Who's the distinguished lady? She whispered, peering around the corner. Not sure, Sophie replied. She seems especially interested in the store, though. When Sophie brought the tea out, she found the woman examining the antique book press James had given her, which now sat proudly on the counter. "Beautiful craftsmanship," the woman commented. "19th century, I believe." "Yes," Sophie confirmed, setting down the teacup. "It was a gift." The woman smiled knowingly. "From James, I assume?" Sophie tensed slightly. "You know James?" "I should hope so," the woman chuckled. "I'm his grandmother, Eleanor Bennett, though he calls me Gran." Sophie's surprise must have shown on her face, because Eleanor laughed, a warm sound that somehow reminded her of James. "He doesn't know I'm here," Eleanor continued, accepting the tea gratefully. "I'm in Portland for a medical consultation, nothing serious, just routine, and I thought I'd see this bookstore he keeps talking about." Her shrewd eyes assessed Sophie. "And meet the young woman who's made such an impression on my grandson." Sophie wasn't sure how to respond, but Eleanor didn't seem to expect an answer. She sipped her tea and glanced around the store with appreciation. "This reminds me of a bookshop in Boston where I used to hide away as a girl," she said. "Books everywhere, that wonderful smell of paper and binding glue, and that sense that each volume holds a different world." "That's exactly how I've always felt," Sophie replied, immediately warming to James's grandmother. They talked as the rain drummed against the windows, about books they loved, about the history of West Side books, and eventually, inevitably, about James. He was always such a serious child, Eleanor reflected. His parents, my son and his wife, were very focused on achievement, success, not much room for play or imagination. She set her teacup down with a sigh. After they divorced, James became even more determined to prove himself, building walls, keeping people at a distance. Sophie listened, piecing together parts of James she was still coming to understand. "When he told me about you," Eleanor continued, "I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard in years, lightness, uncertainty even." Her eyes crinkled with amusement. "Uncertainty is good for James. He's been too certain about everything for too long." Before Sophie could respond, the bell above the door jingled and James himself walked in, stopping short at the sight of his grandmother sitting comfortably at the counter. "Gran?" he said, bewilderment clear on his face. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor rose to embrace him. "Surprising you, obviously, and meeting this lovely young woman you've been keeping to yourself." James looked between them, a mixture of confusion and wariness on his face. "I see you two have been talking." "Don't worry, dear," Eleanor patted his cheek affectionately. "I've been perfectly behaved, no embarrassing childhood stories. Yet." The tension in James's shoulders eased slightly, and Sophie saw a softness in his expression she'd rarely witnessed, a glimpse of the boy beneath the man's careful composure. Eleanor stayed for an hour, charming customers who came in and sharing stories that painted a picture of James's childhood Sophie had never seen. When she finally announced she needed to leave for her appointment, James insisted on driving her. "I'll be back later," he told Sophie, kissing her cheek lightly. Eleanor hugged Sophie warmly. "I hope we'll see more of each other, dear. Perhaps you could both come to Boston this spring. The cherry blossoms in the public garden are quite something." After they left, Maya emerged from the poetry section, where she'd been pretending not to eavesdrop. "So, that's his grandmother?" "She's amazing." Sophie nodded, still processing the encounter. "She is." "And she likes you," Maya added, nudging Sophie's shoulder. "That's huge, right?" It was huge, Sophie realized. Meeting Eleanor had made James's world seem less foreign, less intimidating. It had also shown her a side of him she was only beginning to understand, the child who had built success as a fortress against vulnerability. That evening, after closing the store, Sophie and James walked through the rain to her small apartment above a vintage record shop. They'd fallen into the habit of alternating between her cozy space and his modern downtown loft, each place reflecting their different worlds. "I'm sorry about Gran showing up unannounced," James said as they climbed the narrow stairs. "She can be determined." Sophie smiled, unlocking her door. "I liked her. She reminds me of you, actually." "God help us both," James laughed, but there was affection in his voice. Inside, Sophie's apartment welcomed them with its simple charm, bookshelves lining every available wall, mismatched furniture collected from thrift stores, and strings of fairy lights casting a warm glow. James had grown to love this space more than his own carefully designed loft. As Sophie made tea in the tiny kitchen, James stood by her window, looking out at the rain-slicked street below. "Gran invited us to Boston," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "She did," Sophie confirmed, bringing 2 steaming mugs to the small table by the window. "Would you want to go?" he asked, turning to face her. "It's okay if you don't. Gran can be overwhelming and my family is—" "Complicated?" Sophie suggested. James smiled wryly. "That's one word for it." Sophie considered the question. Meeting more of James's family, seeing the world he came from, it was another step toward something deeper, more permanent. "I'd like to go," she said finally. "I want to know all the parts of you, James, even the complicated ones." He took her hand across the table, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "There's something else I've been wanting to ask you," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Sophie waited, sensing his nervousness. "My lease is up next month," he continued, "and I've been thinking, this apartment is small, but my place feels empty most of the time, especially when you're not there. Maybe we could find somewhere new, together." The question hung in the air between them. Moving in together was a significant step, especially for 2 people who had built careful walls around their hearts. "Are you sure?" Sophie asked softly. "It's a big change." James met her gaze steadily. "I've never been more sure of anything. These past months with you have shown me what I was missing. Not just someone to share my life with, but a reason to come home at the end of the day." He squeezed her hand gently. "You make wherever we are feel like home." Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. After years of loss and caution, of keeping people at a safe distance, she was being offered a chance at something she'd almost stopped believing in, a place to truly belong with someone who saw her completely. "Yes," she whispered, and then more firmly, "Yes, I'd like that." James's smile lit his entire face, the rare, unguarded joy that still caught her breath. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the rain tapped a gentle rhythm against the window, a soundtrack to this new beginning. They spent the evening planning, dreaming, imagining the home they might create together, something that would blend his minimalist taste with her love of cozy chaos, a place with plenty of bookshelves and morning light. Later, as they lay tangled together in Sophie's small bed, James whispered against her hair, "Thank you." "For what?" she murmured sleepily. "For being in that alley that night, for hugging a stranger, for showing me there's more to life than what I'd built for myself." Sophie smiled in the darkness, remembering the rain, the broken man, the wedding ring she'd slipped into his pocket. "Maybe we both needed saving," she replied softly. Outside, Portland continued its winter symphony of rain and wind, but inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Sophie and James had found shelter from the storm, not just from the weather, but from the loneliness that had defined their lives for too long. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. 2 once broken people who had found, in each other's cracks and imperfections, a perfect place to belong. Spring arrived in Portland with an explosion of cherry blossoms and daffodils, transforming the rain-soaked city into a canvas of color. Sophie and James had found a charming craftsman house in the Selwood neighborhood, with a wraparound porch, original hardwood floors, and large windows that filled the rooms with light. It was a perfect blend of history and potential, much like their relationship. Moving day brought together the different aspects of their lives in unexpected ways. Maya arrived with coffee and donuts, directing the placement of Sophie's beloved bookshelves with military precision. Robert Caldwell, James's lawyer, who had become an unlikely ally, helped carry boxes of James's tech equipment, discussing legal matters between trips. Even Eleanor had sent a housewarming gift, an antique reading lamp with a handwritten note, "To light your new chapter together." By evening, exhausted but content, Sophie and James sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Their fingers intertwined naturally, a habit neither noticed anymore. "Happy?" James asked, his voice soft in the gathering twilight. Sophie nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It feels right, doesn't it? Like all the pieces finally fit." James brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I never thought I'd have this. A home that feels like home." The following weeks were filled with the small joys of building a life together. Arguments about where furniture should go, discoveries of each other's habits, James's surprising fondness for cooking elaborate breakfasts, Sophie's tendency to leave books in every room, and the gradual merging of two separate lives into something shared and new. James still ran his company, but he'd delegated more responsibility to his management team, allowing him time to develop a foundation focused on literacy programs in underserved communities, a project inspired by Sophie's passion for getting books to children who needed them. Sophie continued managing Westside Books, which had gained popularity after a local documentary filmmaker included it in a piece about Portland's literary heritage. Their relationship wasn't without challenges. Sometimes James retreated into work when stressed, falling back on old patterns of emotional distance. Sophie occasionally struggled with insecurity, wondering if James would eventually tire of her simpler approach to life. But they were learning to recognize these moments and face them together with honesty and patience. One warm April evening, as they prepared for their trip to Boston to visit Eleanor, Sophie found James in their home office, staring at his computer screen with unusual intensity. "Everything okay?" she asked, setting a cup of tea beside him. He looked up, a strange expression on his face. "I just got an email from Olivia." Sophie stilled, her hand resting on his shoulder. In the months since the holiday gala, Olivia had faded from their lives, reportedly traveling in Europe after accepting a position with an international fashion magazine. "What does she want?" Sophie asked, keeping her voice neutral. James turned the screen toward her. "She's getting married, to a French photographer she met in Paris." He shook his head, bemused. "She wants us to come to the wedding." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Us? As in, both of us?" "Apparently." James ran a hand through his hair. "She says she's found what she was looking for, and she wants to heal old wounds before starting her new life." Sophie sat in the chair beside him, considering. "Do you want to go?" James was quiet for a moment. "A year ago, this would have devastated me. Now, I just feel relieved for her, and grateful." "Grateful?" Sophie echoed. He turned to her, taking her hands in his. "If she hadn't left me at that altar, I wouldn't have been in that alley. You wouldn't have found me. We wouldn't be here." His eyes were soft with wonder. "Sometimes, the worst moments lead to the best ones." Sophie smiled, squeezing his hands. "So philosophical, Mr. Bennett." "I've been reading a lot of books lately," he replied with a grin. "I have this amazing bookstore manager who keeps recommending life-changing literature." They decided to send Olivia a polite note declining the invitation but wishing her happiness, a gesture of closure that felt right for both of them. Their trip to Boston the following week was a revelation. Eleanor's stately Beacon Hill home, filled with antiques and family history, offered Sophie glimpses into James's heritage that helped her understand him better. She saw photographs of a serious little boy with his mother and father before their divorce, school pictures showing his gradual transformation into the focused young man who would build a tech empire, and, most touchingly, recent pictures of James and Sophie that Eleanor had printed and framed, placing them prominently among family heirlooms. "You're good for him," Eleanor told Sophie one afternoon as they walked through the public garden, cherry blossoms drifting around them like snow. "He smiles now, really smiles, not that press conference grimace he perfected." Sophie laughed. "He's good for me too. He pushes me to dream bigger than I thought I could." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That's what love should do. Not complete us, but expand us." She patted Sophie's arm. "My late husband and I had 52 years together. Not all easy, mind you, but all worthwhile. I see that same potential in you two." On their last evening in Boston, James took Sophie to dinner at a small Italian restaurant tucked away on a cobblestone street. The place was intimate and charming, with candles flickering on white tablecloths and a violinist playing softly in the corner. "Gran recommended it," James explained as they were seated at a secluded table. "Apparently, she and my grandfather had their first date here." Sophie smiled, touched by the sentiment. "It's beautiful." Throughout dinner, she noticed James seemed distracted, checking his watch and glancing toward the door. When their dessert arrived, tiramisu to share, he reached across the table for her hands. "Sophie," he began, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "this past year has been transformative. Before I met you, I thought success meant achievements, recognition, building something impressive. Now I know it's about connection, purpose, creating a life with meaning." Sophie felt her heart quicken as James reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I had this whole speech planned," he continued with a self-deprecating smile, "about how you found me at my lowest point and showed me what real strength looks like, about how your kindness and integrity challenge me every day to be better. But sitting here now, looking at you, all I really want to say is that I love you, Sophie Turner, completely, and I want to spend my life with you." He opened the box, revealing a ring that took her breath away, not because of its size or sparkle, though it had both, but because it was so perfectly her. An antique setting with a central diamond surrounded by tiny sapphires, elegant but not ostentatious. "Will you marry me?" James asked, his blue eyes filled with vulnerability and hope. Sophie felt tears spill onto her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." James slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. As it settled into place, the violinist approached their table, the music swelling into a romantic crescendo. Other diners, noticing what was happening, broke into applause. "I hope you don't mind an audience," James said softly. "I wanted to do this right." Sophie laughed through her tears. "It's perfect. You're perfect." He leaned across the table to kiss her, and in that moment, surrounded by strangers' good wishes and the sweet notes of the violin, Sophie felt the last pieces of her guarded heart finally surrender to joy. 1 year later, on a crisp October afternoon, much like the day they first met, Sophie stood in the back room of West Side Books, smoothing the skirt of her simple ivory dress. Maya fussed with the small wreath of baby's breath in Sophie's hair, while Eleanor adjusted the vintage lace veil, a Bennett family heirloom she'd insisted Sophie wear. "Something borrowed," Eleanor said with satisfaction, "and it matches your dress perfectly." Sophie's dress was indeed perfect. Not a traditional wedding gown, but a 1940s-inspired tea-length dress with delicate buttons down the back and subtle beading that caught the light when she moved. It suited her, just as their unconventional wedding plans suited them both. When they'd begun planning their wedding, Sophie and James had quickly agreed they wanted something intimate and meaningful rather than elaborate. The ceremony would take place in the bookstore where their story had truly begun, with only their closest friends and family present. Afterward, they'd host a reception at their home, transformed by twinkling lights and flowers for the occasion. "Are you nervous?" Maya asked, adjusting her own emerald green bridesmaid dress. Sophie shook her head, surprised by her own calm. "Not at all. It feels like we've been moving toward this moment since that night in the rain." A soft knock at the door announced Robert Caldwell, who had become a genuine friend over the past year. "It's time," he said with a warm smile. "James is waiting, and I think he might wear a hole in the floor if he paces any more." Sophie had asked Robert to walk her down the aisle, a role he'd accepted with unexpected emotion, confessing that in his 20 years as James's lawyer and friend, he'd never seen him as happy as Sophie made him. The main floor of West Side Books had been transformed for the occasion. Bookshelves created natural aisles, lined with candles and small arrangements of autumn flowers. Chairs for their 30 guests filled the central space, and at the front, beneath the large window where they'd shared so many conversations, stood James. When Sophie appeared at the end of the aisle on Robert's arm, James's expression made her heart soar. Wonder, joy, and a love so tangible it seemed to fill the room. He wore a dark blue suit that matched his eyes, with no tie, and a small book-shaped pin on his lapel, a gift from Sophie. Their vows were simple but profound, words they'd written together over late-night conversations about what they wanted their marriage to be. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. "To support your dreams as you've supported mine. To be honest, even when it's difficult. To choose you every day as you've chosen me." James's voice was husky with feeling as he repeated the same vows, adding, "You found me when I was lost and showed me the way home. I promise to spend my life making sure you always have a home in me." When they exchanged rings, his a simple platinum band, hers designed to complement her engagement ring, the golden light of late afternoon streamed through the window, bathing them in warmth. "By the power vested in me," said their officiant, an old friend of Sophie's from college, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Their kiss was gentle but filled with promise, sealing a journey that had begun with a hug in the rain and would continue through whatever storms or sunshine lay ahead. At the reception, their backyard glowed with string lights and lanterns. Tables scattered across the lawn held books as centerpieces, each one significant to their story, from The Alchemist to Jane Eyre. Guests mingled comfortably, the boundaries between their different worlds dissolving in celebration. As evening deepened, James led Sophie to the center of the garden for their first dance. The music began, not a traditional wedding song, but The Book of Love by Peter Gabriel. Its lyrics about love's simple power, perfectly capturing what they'd found in each other. "Happy?" James whispered as they swayed together under the stars. Sophie looked up at him, at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own, yet still held the capacity to surprise her. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied. Later, as the party continued around them, they slipped away to the porch swing, their favorite spot for quiet conversations. James draped his jacket around Sophie's shoulders against the autumn chill. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, worn object. Sophie recognized it immediately, the wedding ring she'd found beside him that rainy night, the one she'd slipped into his pocket before walking away. "You kept it all this time?" she asked, touching it gently. James nodded. "It reminded me of you, of kindness without expectation. I carried it with me for months, until I found the courage to come find you at the bookstore." He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "I thought today would be the right day to give it back to you, full circle." Sophie felt tears threaten again. "What should we do with it?" James smiled. "I thought we might keep it in a special place, as a reminder of how we found each other. And someday, maybe we'll tell our children the story, how sometimes the end of one dream is just the beginning of a better one." "Our children," Sophie repeated softly, the words filling her with warmth. "I like the sound of that." They sat together in comfortable silence, the ring nestled between their joined hands, a small gold circle that had once represented loss but now symbolized their journey, from strangers in the rain to partners for life. Around them, Portland prepared for another night of gentle rain, the first drops beginning to patter on the porch roof. But Sophie and James remained on their swing, sheltered and content, no longer afraid of storms or what they might wash away. They had built something stronger than the past that had once defined them, a love born from kindness, nurtured through understanding, and strong enough to weather whatever the future might bring. In the bookstore window across town, The Alchemist still sat on display, its pages holding the wisdom that had guided them from the beginning. When you want something, all the universe conspires in helping you to achieve it. For Sophie and James, that conspiracy had begun with a rainy night, a broken heart, and a hug freely given, the first words in a story that would continue, page by page, for the rest of their lives.